welcome everybody to the Bologna Centre and to the first puntata, or the first event in the History of the Present seminar series. This is going to be a series which will discuss major developments in world politics in historical context, and we'll try and make an assessment of their historical significance. Now, we've got three distinguished European speakers lined up for the other seminars later in the year, one from Spain, one from Germany, one from the LSE. But tonight's speaker is a distinguished colleague from DC, Daniel Markey. Now, Professor Markey has been Senior Research Professor and Director of SAIS's Global Policy Programme since 2015. Before coming to SAIS, he worked in the Department of Politics at Princeton University, served as a member of the policy planning staff in the second Bush administration in the State Department, and between 2007 and 2015 he was Senior Fellow for India, Pakistan and South Asia at the Council of Foreign Relations. Professor Markey is the author of two important books: No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relationship with Islamabad, 2013, and this year, China's Western Horizon, Beijing and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia. And it's this book that's the source of his seminar tonight. Ambassador Joseph Trani, the former deputy chief of the CIA, has said, and I quote, "The section of this book, of Professor Markey's book, dealing with the strategic options for the United States in continental Eurasia should be required reading for anyone interested in US-China relations." Peter Frankopan, who by chance is somebody I actually know, is the author of the best-selling The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, and of the New Silk Roads, The Present and Future of the World, has described Professor Markey's book as, I quote, "a far-reaching and important primer that is filled with insights about the world of today and tomorrow." He added, "This fine book is essential reading for anyone interested in international affairs." Dan, I wish you were here in Bologna, as we've exchanged many emails about over the last 6 months or so, as we planned. But anyway, I welcome you virtually to Bologna anyway. Floor's yours for the next 40 minutes or so, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that warm introduction. I completely agree that I would so much rather be able to join you in person, and that I was really looking forward to a visit to Bologna and to your Institute for Policy Research. Thanks especially for including me in the series. Obviously, this is a shift from our some of our earlier plans, but I do hope that this book that I've written fits in well with this notion of telling the history of the present, or thinking about how political shifts of the present fit into a broader historical context. And let me just dive right in. I mean, I think we begin, needing to appreciate, and I imagine that many of your other speakers will say something similar, that China's rise, so to speak, in so many different ways, its increasing power and wealth and so on, is the international political shift of the 21st century. At least the first half of this century, and we'll see where we go. And one piece of that, the piece that I pick off for this book, and one aspect of the rise of China, which I think is probably best understood, and I'll explain this a bit more, as historically unprecedented, is the extension of China's influence across this vast swath of territory of continental Eurasia. And it might be useful, I think we have a map from the book, we can pop that up now just so people can see what I'm talking about, so it's quite clear what continental Eurasia actually means. I think what you'll see is, and here we've got the map here, great. This is directly pulled from the book, so you can see that I'm talking about South Asia, so the part India and Pakistan, Afghanistan principally, Central Asia, the areas to the north. In the book, I principally focus on Kazakhstan, and the Middle East. And in the book there, I principally focus on Saudi Arabia and Iran. But I open each one of the chapters on each of these sub-regions of continental Eurasia with a bit of a historical narrative. And that narrative recounts the long sweep of China's relations with these parts of the world. Really, I try to start going back almost to the mists of time, to prehistory, pre-recorded history, to things that we found in burial tombs that clearly moved from South Asia, the seashells that moved from South Asia all the way into China, so suggesting that there was obviously a trade routes even before they were discussed. And then to more recorded history, particularly from Chinese perspectives. Now, these narratives really only amount to a few pages within the overall book, so this isn't the core of the book. But I did them with something specific in mind. What we're seeing now in terms of China's expansion into these regions resonates with events of the distant past. So it is useful to know about the old Silk Road, or about Buddhist pilgrimage routes, or Ming Dynasty maritime exploration through the Indian Ocean, or imperial wars fought in Central Asia and over Central Asia, or the pre-Islamic Persian embassies that came to China's then capital in Xi'an. But none of those events is actually a natural or necessary precursor to what we are witnessing now. This is something new and different and very modern. And I think it's important to recognize that China's involvement in this part of the world is not constrained or defined by the past, not even in ways that it is constrained and defined in many ways when it looks to its east, its relations with Japan or with Korea or with Vietnam or elsewhere in the Asia Pacific, where that more recent history is so defining of the nature of interstate relations. There's much more openness in this region to China in important ways. But that history, I think, is necessary to recount. And what I'd like to do today is ask and answer, to some extent, three basic questions. First, what is China up to? What is it trying to do in continental Eurasia, in this part of the world? And it's fine if we keep the map away, but now you have a sense as to the part of the world that I'm talking about. Second, how is Eurasia writ large responding to China? And there, it's obviously, it's a much more complicated story. And third, why does this matter to the rest of us? And of course, as someone who's sitting more or less in the Washington, D.C. area, I have a DC-centric approach to this. As somebody who's worked, as Mark mentioned, as Professor Gilbert mentioned, at the State Department, I have a particular policy lens through which I see this. But I'm hopeful that some of the policy recommendations and other observations on this point that are more directed toward the United States will also resonate with European audiences, or at least be of interest to you. Okay, so question one, what does China want in Eurasia? In 2014, so not so long ago, China appointed a new ambassador to Afghanistan. In fact, he was named as a kind of a complement or a counterpart to our then senior representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, a special representative, Richard Holbrooke. And the appointment of this ambassador, Sun Yuxi, marked, I think, and I write about this in the book briefly, a new ambition by Beijing and a new expression of what China intended to do in what might be called the Greater Middle East. And that encompasses most, if not all, or much of what I'm describing here, these territories to China's west. And so meeting Sun Yuxi, as I did in Washington, I was impressed by his freedom to express greater ambitions for China's role in particular, in Afghanistan at the time, in convening other groups of diplomats, in playing a much more energetic role than we had seen before. And other diplomats, American diplomats, remarked on this as well, as this is something new, a breath of fresh air from China. They even welcomed it. So I was saying that this appointment of Ambassador Sun Yishi reflected a broader shift, I think, in China's agenda in what I describe as continental Eurasia along China's western horizon. And this has been driven partly by a longer term set of economic, security, and even strategic ambitions in Beijing. And that some of them relate to President Xi Jinping and his coming to office. Many of them, though, have a longer timeline than that. On the economic side, what we've seen, of course, now for several decades, is that the extension of China's involvement in, particularly in Central Asia and the Middle East, has been driven by this incredible thirst for energy to power China's economy. Hydrocarbon, the need for oil, for gas, and so on, has driven a lot of China's investment and involvement in these countries. But it's also related, that itself is also related to a desire in Beijing to begin to develop its Western provinces, including Xinjiang, but not limited to it. And to do so, a sense that that would need also the development of the nearby neighborhood beyond China's borders to trade and be interconnected with China's Western provinces, to bring those up to a level of development beyond where they had been, and to, in a way, try to rectify the imbalance in development within China writ large between its eastern provinces, which were comparatively wealthy, and its western provinces, comparatively poor. So there's an economic rationale to all of this that has driven China westward. But there's also a security and kind of a defensive security rationale, principally driven by concerns in Beijing about security in Xinjiang, where you have, of course, a Muslim majority, and where there was a concern about that majority being opposed to the regime, the Communist Party regime in Beijing. And so what you've seen there is, I think, a dual-pronged strategy, security strategy. The one piece that we have heard so much about, I think rightly over the past couple of years, an iron-fisted crackdown on political dissent, the creation of these camps, re-education camps, even concentration camps, prisons, and so on, ruthless repression of political dissent. But you've also seen a development campaign, not just within Xinjiang, but beyond it, to parts of its western horizon. And the goal here, as explained to me by a number of Chinese experts, is the idea that in order to tackle the problem of extremism, of terrorism, of Islamist fundamentalism, you need to raise the level of development in countries like Pakistan or Afghanistan or even further afield, so that they are not importing or exporting these dangerous ideas into China's own West. So there's a security rationale there, a political security rationale. And the third piece of it being strategic. There is also a desire in Beijing to extend its capacity to project military power further afield. And we see this in a variety of different ways. But if we think about China's expanding role in Eurasia, and I'll talk more about this later, but if we see this as a capacity to expand its effective power projection capability all the way to the doorstep of Europe even, and certainly of the Middle East, we see an expanded sphere of influence that puts China potentially on par with other continental-sized powers of the past, to escape the confines that it has found itself in, bottled in as a state along the sea coast, often hostile sea coast in East Asia, and to access broader economic markets in the world. Now, in China over the past decade, the Xi Jinping era has accelerated and intensified all of these different logics. And what we have seen is a discussion in China of a very clear shift away from what had historically been a pattern of keeping a low profile, or sometimes described as hiding your capabilities and biding your time, a low profile approach to international affairs, and a shift now to what is sometimes being called striving for achievement. That is really showing that China is a major world power and attempting to change the world in ways that reflect that. We have simultaneously seen a shift in terms of China's activities from a principle of non-interference in the activities of other states, often stated by Chinese officials even now as a kind of respecting of other sovereignty and a request that they respect China's sovereignty. A shift from that to what is now sometimes being described as a diplomacy defined by creative involvement or creative engagement, a direct reflection of a greater ambition for involvement that comes first from this economic involvement, but also from increasing political involvement as well. And we can talk more about examples of this, but one that's sometimes used by the Chinese is their greater involvement in Sri Lanka. And in reflecting, and now Westerners have tended to see that in negative terms, but China has tended to see its involvement as one that was invited by Sri Lankan leaders to get more involved and even played an important role in ending the Sri Lankan civil war. And so this kind of more active engagement, now to be clear, historically, China has actually broken the non-interference rule many, many times. But now it is even publicly and certainly within academic circles debating the question of whether it needs to adhere to this or whether it should redefine its approach to its region. So these are things that China is thinking about. What is it actually doing? Well, it's very clear that China is consolidating its economic influence across this region as it is elsewhere in the world. Trade and investment with China generally outstrip trade and investment with just about any other outside player in many of these countries. It is the preponderant external economic player everywhere. But China has also developed new tools of economic statecraft that go along with that. So this is not simple trade and investment with nothing else involved. It's built its policy banks that are involved in making investments that are not purely for commercial reasons, but also have sometimes a political or strategic rationale, and new funding mechanisms to back its major projects. Principally, this Belt and Road Initiative that we've all heard so much about over the years. This is a principal vehicle for all of these things. Another piece of this, another one we've all heard about a lot, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, which has been both a tool of China convening others to strengthen its investment profile in infrastructure across Asia, but also demonstrates China's leadership as a convening power and as a backer of a major new international organization. It's built, as I say, policy banks like the Import-Export Bank to finance important but potentially risky projects. And other funds, similar funds. And it has even gone so far as to now develop an analog institution to the US Agency for International Development, the China International Development Cooperation Agency, which is explicitly charged with using grant assistance, Chinese grant assistance, in other countries in the neighborhood, something it didn't have before. All of these things bring Chinese goods, they bring money, they bring technologies, they bring workers, they bring rules, they bring economic influence throughout the entire region in ways that we have never seen before out of China. So that's one piece of it. That is the leading piece, the economic piece. But political influence follows shortly thereafter. Even if that first step is trade and investment and these other features, what you see is that economic power delivers political leverage. And it delivers asymmetries and dependencies in Beijing's relations with all of these countries, where China is the principal creditor, where China is the principal trade partner, where China is the principal consumer of the goods that these countries are producing. That comes with political power. At the same time, China is experimenting with a range of other political tools, media campaigns, educational exchanges, and really splashy diplomatic conferences and meetings like the Belt and Road Forums in Beijing over the past few years. It has invested in a global network, a news network, so to speak, but really a propaganda network that will extend good news stories about what China is doing international on the China Global Television Network. It's built Confucius Institutes throughout the region and around the world to educate young people in other countries about how to speak Chinese, to understand China, but also to extend China's message about what it itself wants other countries to think of it. And other tools, some even somewhat more, you might say, nefarious or with even more questionable intent. The extension of Chinese technologies of censorship, of surveillance, so-called smart cities with the capacity to monitor civilian populations in ways that many of these countries would otherwise be unable to do, and in some cases to share that data back to China itself. So it has political leverage as well. And that third piece is the projection of military power. And so here too, again, to reiterate, we begin with an economic story, extends to a political story, but I think over the long term, we're shifting also, or seeing a shift in China's capacity to send military force beyond its borders. You've seen a thorough overhaul, administrative and reform overhaul of the People's Liberation Army, organizational reforms to consolidate it, shift its resources, to create new, particularly naval resources, far seas, power projection capabilities. We've seen something we'd never seen before and something that China had said it would never do, a new base, a military base in Djibouti. Security operations in places like Tajikistan along Afghanistan's border, likely into Afghanistan as well. We've seen major growth in defense sales, things like Chinese drones being sold to countries from Iran to Kazakhstan to Pakistan throughout the region, things that the United States and others have been reluctant to sell to these countries for security reasons. Joint exercises with, again, all manner of partners, including Russia and Iran, and security liaison operations that bring Chinese security personnel into security and information sharing partnerships with internal security agencies in many of these countries as well. All of these things are bringing China into the region, as I say, economically, politically, and now also in a military sense, or at least a security sense, and reflect that broader Chinese ambition. Okay, so that's point number one. That's what China is doing and what China seems to want. How is Eurasia responding? The book that I've written actually spends most of its time on this set of questions, because this is what I think has been so missing from our understanding of what's going on here. The book really focuses on Eurasian states themselves and what, in a political science form, you might say their agency, their role, their interests, their aspirations, their perceptions, how all of these things affect their relations with China. And in the cases of the book, I outline how this is actually unfolding in South Asia, in Central Asia, and in the Middle East. And I narrow my aperture a bit to focus principally on Pakistan, on Kazakhstan, and on Iran, because I see these as the principal partners in each of these subregions for China, because they are most important to China's intentions and because their interests are also overlapping with Chinese interests in important ways. And I ask two basic questions. The first question I ask is, what's happening internally in each one of these countries? Again, to use a political sciencey term, how is their political economy being affected by China's intensifying role in their societies? But to boil it down, what I really ask is, who's winning and who's losing, or who's winning more and who's winning less, and who's losing in objective terms from greater Chinese involvement? So for instance, I'll ask questions about Kazakhstan and where I see Kazakhstan's elites being bailed out by Chinese investments. So they're clear winners in 2008 and 2009, reinforcing their capacity to stay in power and to control the commanding heights of Kazakhstan's economy. But others I see as being losers or relative losers from these relations, or concerned about what more they might lose as China, say, attempts to lease land in their country, upsetting land rights and other sensitive concerns in places like Pakistan or Kazakhstan or Iran. I asked, what kind of political cleavages might be ameliorated or made worse by these developments? So in Pakistan in particular, you have a cleavage between Balochistan, its largest province by size, but smallest population, and the rest of the society, which has spawned a separatist movement over decades now, actually since the foundation of the modern state of Pakistan. And the Baloch separatists are enraged by Chinese investments in their part of Pakistan. This does not serve their interests. They see themselves as losers, and that has exacerbated tensions that were pre-existing. And then I see how local leaders are trying to use Chinese resources, as I mentioned before, things like tools of repression and suppression of opposition forces to serve their own ends. And we see precisely this in Iran, with the Iranian regime using these tools to push back against the Chinese, against their own internal opposition. Okay, so that's one set of questions I asked. The next set of questions I ask is, what's happening between states in each of these subregions? Because it's not just a domestic political story, it's a regional and international story. So some of these Eurasian states increasingly see China as an essential partner in their own efforts to compete against their neighbors, or to withstand pressure from outside powers, including from the United States or from Russia. And in South Asia, for instance, we see China has equities, that is investments, with both Pakistan and India, to the tune of often hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, and these are growing. But by moving into Pakistan in a big way, as it has over the past 5 or 7 years, including with what's called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, tens of billions of dollars of investment, China has convinced Pakistan that it is more or less on its side, and it has also increasingly convinced India that it is not on its side. This has emboldened Pakistan in, I think, important ways in its dealings with its hostile neighbor in India. And it has made India more skeptical and wary of both Pakistan and China going forward. And this, I think, has played into what was already a hostile and difficult regional relationship and actually exacerbated Sino-Indian tensions and India-Pakistan tensions alike. If we look in Central Asia, the storyline is actually is interesting but different. China's interested in courting Russia as well as courting a number of Central Asian states, and Kazakhstan being the one I focus on. It's done so by attempting to claim that China's interests are only economic and don't extend into the political or strategic realm, despite the fact that that's actually also happening. And I perceive that this is gradually stirring some concern, certainly in Moscow, that tends to be understated for reasons that have to do more with Russia's concerns about the West and about pushing back against the United States. But they are simultaneously recognizing that they are not just losing economic influence in Central Asia, but also political influence and increasingly over decades, military influence as well. And so the question is how that shifting balance in terms of dominance along Russia's traditional sphere of influence will change relations between Moscow and Beijing. And then I turn to the Middle East. And here we see that China is itself courted by both the Saudis and the Iranians as a principal buyer of what they are selling, oil and to a lesser extent gas. And both of them are hoping to use their ties with China to not only prop up their economies, but to serve them as they seek to compete against one another, that being a principle defining geopolitical competition in the Middle East, and also to, in the case of Iran, push back against the pressure that has been exerted by Washington. And China has the luxury in the Middle East to not have to choose between these powers. They can actually count on both of them being beholden to China and to continue to have access to cheap and reliable sources of energy, and to enhance its own political influence in a region that has, at least for decades now, been dominated principally by US geopolitical influence and dominance, and to shift the terms of the debate throughout the Middle East. So now all of this gets complicated very quickly, and partly that complication is the point. Localized issues are essential to understanding how China and China's rise will play out over this vast territory. It is not enough to look to see what Beijing wants, or to do the equivalent of Kremlinology in the halls of power in Beijing. One must also ask these more difficult questions about what is happening elsewhere. And of course, that's been true for other rising imperial or neo-imperial, or even the United States has had to grapple, of course, with this challenge. It doesn't matter necessarily just what Washington has wanted. What matters is how that intersects and interacts with what other states have wanted, even states that are much less powerful than the United States. And China, of course, is seeing something similar. Okay, third bit, how does this add up for the United States, for the world, and what should we do about it? I'll be briefer here. But when you think about it, economically, this is a mixed story for American interests. Aspects of what China is doing are utterly unthreatening to the United States. In fact, may complement projects at regional economic integration that Washington has had in mind now for the past few decades. But there are problems and potential problems associated with what you might call economic lock-in by China across this area. China's ability to set standards, or to dominate certain sensitive technological spaces, or even simply to dominate roads and rails, and to do so in ways that are exclusive to other economic interests, and in ways that would privilege Chinese companies but hurt American or European or Japanese or other firms. So there's a mixed economic story at best. On the political front, I think I've hinted at this already and referred to the problem of Chinese influence. It's not just a problem of China being able to get more of what it wants, but of China probably firming up authoritarian and illiberal regimes across this already messy and difficult political swath of territory. This has not been an area that's been all that open and welcoming to democratic and liberal practices or principles, and China's involvement makes that openness even less likely over time, which I think is worrisome from a US perspective. And on the security front, as I've said, although it's early days still, and we shouldn't overstate China's capacity to project its military boot across this region, I do think that we have concerns both of the long-term potential for that, and in the near term of what I've described as a potential to exacerbate existing regional political conflicts, say between India and Pakistan, or Saudi Arabia and Iran. And there are a lot of different possibilities that can play out across this region. But at the very least, we should not anticipate more economic or political reform of the sort that the United States and the West has tended to favor. We should be worried about more regional conflict and less cooperation. And there is this high potential that China will have greater access and influence to parts of the world the United States has historically cared a great deal about and is likely to care about in the future, including Western Europe. So what should we do about it? And I'll wrap up here very briefly. In the book, I recommend a strategy of what I describe as a selective and differentiated competition with China. Use a variety of different options in terms of that competition. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Keeping our options open and recognizing that although this is an important region in the way that I've sketched it out, continental Eurasia is in many ways less important to fundamental American concerns than is East Asia or Western Europe. So we need to put some prioritization here. Because I fear that we're heading, sitting here in Washington, we're heading toward what seems often to be a more mindlessly competitive approach to our dealings with China. And in particular, we're trying to take on China and beat it at its own games. So the principal example that I tend to use is with China's Belt and Road Initiative and its focus on infrastructure investment, our typical reaction has been, if they want to invest in infrastructure, we can invest in more infrastructure than they can. But the practical reality is not only that we can't, but that we shouldn't. We're not especially good at those things at this moment, and it would be a colossal waste of resources and probably a distraction from other areas where we do enjoy a more competitive advantage in dealing with the Chinese. Things like higher education or science and technology or other areas which we are uniquely qualified to do in these regions, including openness of ideas, freedom of speech. And these are the kinds of things that promote innovation and so on, that I think the Chinese ultimately are not particularly well positioned to do. We need to select where we operate, and we need to recognize that in dealing with any one of these states, say Pakistan, or another state that I talk about a bit, Malaysia, just because the state is working with China tends to reflect less of its ideological desire to see China as good or right, and more a sense that China has something to offer them. They are principally seeing the world through the lens of their own interests and their own aspirations. And where China has something to offer, they're willing to take it up. That doesn't make them pro-Chinese, and certainly doesn't make them anti-American or even anti-Western. It simply means that they're looking to advance their interests, and that provides an opening for us. Rather than seeing the world or framing the world through this rigid ideological prism, we should be thinking about it through the lens of regional and localized interests. Last point I would make is we also need in this region to be open to a degree of tactical cooperation with China. There will be areas in this region that are actually more important, certainly in the near term, than our competition, our global geopolitical competition with the Chinese. For instance, a potential war between India and Pakistan, or Iran's developing nuclear program. These are the kinds of things that would bring potentially major war, even nuclear war, to the world in ways that we and the Chinese, I think, have a firm interest in avoiding. And so these are areas where we need to try to find ways to buffer our ability to at least harmonize our efforts with the Chinese, if not actively cooperate with them. We need to buffer that activity from our broader geopolitical competition. Otherwise, we run near-term enormous risks that could define the future as much as anything else. So let me leave it here, and I think I've gone on long enough. I'm looking forward to the questions and the conversation, and thanks again. I've been excited to join you. I just wish I could see you all sitting there in person.
Thank you, Dan. We've got a round of applause here, which I hope you could hear. Apart from anything else, I think I've been here at SAIS since 2012, and I've never known a speaker stick so close to the 40-minute limit. So I think you deserve a special medal of honor for that. Now, what I'm going to do is, before I open up the floor for questions to the floor using the Q&A mechanism, I'm just going to give people time to send messages or decide what questions they're going to ask by just asking you one or two questions myself, based on your incredibly interesting and thought-provoking talk. And I'm not particularly, or not even at all, an expert on China or Eurasia. And so I'm just going to pick up on one or two conceptual points that you mentioned as you were talking. And, you know, the title of your book, Geopolitics, which brings to mind Mackinder. And there's a sense in which this is Mackinder 101, no? Whoever controls the heartland controls the world island, whoever controls the world island controls the world. Now, I'm not claiming that this is some sign of Chinese interest in geopolitical domination of the world, but there is a certain this is something that throughout the Cold War, people were very conscious of, no? The need to control Eurasia for geopolitical and strategic purposes. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. The second question which sprang to my mind was your use of the word. In fact, you hesitated and glossed over and were wondering which word to use. And that was the word neo-imperial. Is this an imperial strategy? And if so, of what kind? That's, I think, a question. Imperialism is an interesting topic, isn't it? And we have a tendency to think of imperialism in the context of the European domination of Africa in the 19th century or of Asia in the 19th century. But, imperialism is a fact of human history. Is this a new form of imperialism? Question mark. And my third point is, I know very well, that you're one of America's leading experts on South Asia and India. You mentioned India several times in this talk, but I was wondering what you thought the response was to the strategy by China from New Delhi. So if you could respond to those first three, and then I'll take questions from the floor.
Great, great questions, and I'm happy to take them on. They're definitely things that I've thought about at some length as I was writing this book and afterwards. Your first point about Mackinder and the World Island and so on. This is, of course, at the heart of certain American strategists' concern about what China may in fact get out of an extension of its influence across this region. And it's important to sort of play this out a little bit in a variety of different ways. And I won't do all of them, but one of the questions I sometimes get is very different, which is sort of, what's the point? This is a messy, ugly, difficult part of the world. So suppose China gets more of it. What's the big deal? This is actually China picking up pain and difficulty rather than strategic assets. And in particular, since I work on Pakistan a fair amount, if China wants to have a greater involvement in Pakistan, well, wouldn't that be the single best thing from an American interest in terms of competition with China? Because more control in Pakistan or more involvement in Pakistan will only bring China grief and certainly not power. And I think there's some degree of reality to that. These are difficult places, and a big part of what I try to write about is just the limits of China's ability to control these areas. And that directly relates to your second point about the question of what kind of imperial rule this is. The old-fashioned imperialism isn't just not possible for Western countries, but it's also not really possible for China, and it's not really what China is attempting to do. It is a new kind of imperialism, in a sense, if it is to be called anything like that. I think it should be, in part because there is an asymmetry in the economic relationship that then creates a vulnerability and a deep dependency in a political context, and then would permit China to turn that into a porousness in these societies, in these countries, to its military and security presence as well. And so that to me looks like a version of imperialism in which Chinese gets something asymmetrical out of this relationship, but it is not a territorial control strategy. And that's where I tend to push back on those who say if China wants Pakistan, then let them have it. I say China can both avoid actually dealing with the messiness of these societies or fixing their problems or even bringing stability to them, can simultaneously do that and find that it can pick up assets that are militarily and even economically useful to it. It can have its cake and eat it too, without paying some of the prices. It feels no obligation to invest in, as we might, in democratic institutions or long-term sustainable political development in the ways that we think we should. China can simply abdicate that sort of responsibility and extend its influence in these societies and across them in ways that, coming back to this world island question, would over time give it a continental-sized footprint in the world. Now here too, even if it had that, we would have to ask, as many have, even about Mackinder, is having control over a big slice of land really that valuable when the United States is the world's maritime great power? And perhaps that wouldn't be such a bad thing to see the United States continue to devote itself to developing its military power at sea and at the littoral across this continent, that is a means by which island powers, whether it's the United States or Great Britain before it, could continue to be great powers and not have to worry about all of the continental-sized problems that that brings along. I think that's what we need to be thinking about. And I would just add to that, that's precisely what many Chinese strategists are asking themselves. And a number of them are framing their extension of influence into continental Eurasia in Mackinder terms. They are justifying in those terms, and they are arguing in those terms. And so this is at the core of the debate. Last question you had to do with India and its response to China. The answer here is, of course, India is both started by being wary and skeptical, and then increasingly became critical of Chinese intentions and motivations and goals with the Belt and Road Initiative, and especially in the piece of that Belt and Road Initiative closest to India's borders in Pakistan, this China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. India protested that vociferously at the outset, has continued to protest it, and that wariness has only heightened India's concerns about what China is really up to in Pakistan. It may have played into even some of India's own calculations as it made decisions on shifting the terms of administrative control in Kashmir, which effectively borders both China and Pakistan, and has now undoubtedly played into India's fear, concern, grievance, anger, and hostility toward China, as they have literally come to blows along their contested border, the line of actual control in the high mountains, and I think is beginning to, if not has already, reshaped India's broad consensus about how to think about China, from a more open-minded, economically oriented mentality that dominated and has dominated Indian thinking for several decades now, to a more strategically oriented and much more concerned, limited desire to interact with China, to constrain even their economic interactions in ways that Indians would have been reluctant to do in the past. So, so the story for India and India's relations with China so far has not been a happy one. So hopefully I touched on answers to all of your questions. I look forward to some of the others.
Right, you absolutely did. Now, before I'm going to just launch, just tell people about the Q&A. We're using Bologna Center rules, which means what you do is you send me a note on the Q&A if you're connecting by internet, and you please state your name and where you're from. But before we pick up with questions from the audience, I've already had two from the Q&A. The first is by Davide Tabarelli, and Davide asks, Dan, why are the countries of the area so blasé, in effect, about China's lack of democracy? And generally speaking, I think the point of the question is, could you say a little bit more about the broader effects for democracy in the region? And the second question I've had already is from Mirek Hosman, who asked about the role of the AIIB. And he says, why is China operated through this particular method of development bank? Why not do bilateral deals with individual countries?
Great.
Take two at a time.
Great questions. So the first one, why are countries in the region blasé about China's attitudes regarding democracy? You know, the short, glib answer is they themselves are not terribly democratic, and so they could care less, at least their leaders could care less about this issue. Now, there are clear exceptions to this, but that's obviously the case in a country like Iran or Saudi Arabia, or to a somewhat lesser extent, Kazakhstan, where they have concerns not unrelated to democracy per se, but having more to do with China's treatment of its own people and human rights, to concerns, clearly Russia is not a great defender of democracy, so they have little concern about that. Even in Pakistan, which is nominally at least a democracy, although one that has a very strong military dominance over that political institution, even there, the aspects of China's model, so to speak, that are highlighted are its developmental model and its effectiveness in growing China's economy. And there hasn't been much attention to China's political model. And if there is, China always has a ready response, which is we're not attempting to export our political model anywhere. We simply believe that we can work together with any kind of state and that each state will have its own model. But that's, in a way, not at all a serious response. The real reality is, at the moment, China is working most closely with the least democratic pieces of the Pakistani system, including directly with the army, because it sees the army as the most efficient and effective means to get things done, including things in the civilian economy, including infrastructure investment and so on. So the lack of interest in democracy is not a one-way China only, it is throughout the region. And sadly, even in India, we're seeing a kind of a creeping questions about populism, even a more illiberal approach to governance, which is really worrisome. And we wouldn't be surprised to hear, say, Prime Minister Narendra Modi critique China principally on the basis of its political institutions. There are many other things he would critique them over, but not so much that. And so the champions of democracy are few and far between in this region is the answer. The second, now the people as a whole, and I can get into this more, you could say that they're in favor of it, but the question is there, since they are not well placed to push for these types of ideals in their own societies, China's involvement is actually undermining the capacity of, say, champions of a more liberal order in these societies to do much about it. And sadly, in some instances, is reinforcing, as I said before, the tools of repression and surveillance and censorship that are used against them. On AIIB, this is a great question too. Why bother to use this bank? So one of the things that I found in my research and conversations with the Chinese is that they have actually a tiered system for how they do overseas infrastructure investment. AIIB, actually there's ADB, so Asian Development Bank, and other multilateral lenders have actually done a great deal to invest in some of the projects that are now more or less identified as Chinese projects. So when I went to Kazakhstan and was able to travel up to the border between Kazakhstan and China and visit the new dry port that's built there and the free trade area along that border, which is really in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. That road that I took that was still being built at the time, a couple of years ago, and the rail line alongside it and the pipeline as well, much of that investment actually was Asian Development Bank investment, where the Chinese have played a role in trying to influence how that investment would go and to be a champion for making sure that roads and rails and pipelines would lead into and out of China. And so these were not actually Chinese funded projects at all, or even in some cases, they weren't always Chinese built. But our driver referred to the brand new fancy road as the Chinese road. Why? In part because it was leading to China, and in part because all of these things are associated with China. Now, that's at the highest level. So anything that's really a first-class investment that seems to make a lot of sense, commercial sense, political sense, everything else, can go to the ADB. And just short of that, the AIIB has a similar dedication to quality of investment and is not throwing money away into projects that are just for political purposes or even strategic purposes or whatever. It really wants to show good return on investment and that it's done all of its homework. So the AIIB is run to a high standard, and China can throw really gold quality projects at the AIIB. Short of that, though, it does do exactly what the questioner asked. It goes to its own policy banks, and it uses Chinese policy banks to fund investments that may not live up to those higher standards, but may still qualify as the kinds of things that China wants to advance, possibly because it wants to firm up a relationship with another country, or because it thinks that that investment will pay dividends to China itself, or it has some other strategic motive or rationale, so it can go to those banks. As it goes farther down the list, it may even go to grants rather than loans in situations like the port of Gwadar, which I write about extensively in this book, in Pakistan, it's principally done so through what appear to be grants rather than loans. And it is clearly seeing that as it's not a commercially viable, economically viable venture. It's a strategically relevant venture. And so it'll fund that out of Chinese funds directly. One last piece, which kind of, I think, reinforces this point, is sometimes countries have come to China with projects that they themselves are interested in getting funding for, but which are neither commercially viable nor strategically valuable to China. And one of the values of the AIIB is that the Chinese officials have been able to tell those countries and their leaders to go and try to work with the AIIB to get their projects passed. And of course, the AIIB, having higher standards, will reject them, but China doesn't need to reject them out of hand, doesn't have to pay a political cost or price for saying no. And so China can use that bank in different ways. And the last way is its convening power, its demonstration of global leadership, its rejection of existing multilateral institutions which have so long been dominated by the West and by Japan. China has gone its own way with the AIIB, which is demonstrating its power as well.
Okay, I'm just going to take two more questions from the feed, and then I've got a couple of questions at least from the hall. Okay, so two quick questions from the list of people writing here, then two from the hall. First is from Dan Lieberman, and he's saying, has China deliberately supported authoritarian regimes, or is it just part of a non-interference policy in other nations? And to what extent does it support or not support countries that are close to the United States, I think is his point. And then we have a question on China's military ideas. I mean, how do you go about, says Sean McDonough from DC, quantifying the strategic gains that China gets out of the installment of full-scale military operations in Guadar or Chabar? And then just one final one. Eliza Hunt is asking, in your opinion, would the potential for proxied involvement in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict by Russia and Turkey and subsequent destabilization be enough for China to become involved in early on? Then I'll take a couple from the hall.
All right, great. Not easy questions, but good ones. So does China demonstrate deliberate support for autocratic regimes?
Yeah.
My short answer would be yes. But does it do so because it cares that they are autocratic? I'm not convinced that it does. I mean, I'm open to arguments on that, but its preference is for efficiency and effectiveness in dealing with these states and less messiness. And China has found itself on the receiving end of surprise democratic elections in ways that make it wary about working with more democratic states. So if we think about the surprise outcome of the recent election in Malaysia, or if we look at Sri Lanka, or if we look even at Pakistan, in each case, we have, over the past 5+ years, seen a surprise victor in an election that took Beijing by surprise, and in a way kind of nullified, maybe too strong, but undermined a number of investments that they had made in the previous regime, and led them to have to now cultivate a new political set of players in that other nation's capital, and that not terribly welcome. I don't think that Beijing has gone to the point that it will now support an illiberal, undemocratic regime purely to avoid that, because there are downside risks to even working with illiberal and democratic regimes in terms of succession scenarios. And in the book, I go on at some length about who will come next in Kazakhstan. Nazarbayev has nominally given up his role as president, but in fact is still in charge. So what's going to happen when he dies? And how will that affect Chinese interests? You know, the transitions in undemocratic regimes are often even messier and more violent than in democratic ones. So China, I think, has to be careful what it wishes for in this way. But what we can say is that China has clearly invested, say, in the clearly illiberal, undemocratic, ruthless regime in Iran. And will continue to do so, and looks to be poised to do even more in that respect, particularly if, for instance, Trump wins the election here, the United States continues with its hardline policy with Iran, Iran is backed into a corner, and US-China relations deteriorate. China has already shown that it would be willing to play a kind of a backer of Iran. And to back this particular regime, even against its domestic opponents. It has provided them with the tools that Iran might not otherwise have, probably wouldn't otherwise have, to shut down the internet, to shut down opposition voices, to control and surveil protests, and to push back against any kind of creeping liberalism. Now, Iran was already pretty good at all of those things. But China has clearly invested in them. So yeah, I think there's deliberate support, but exactly why and how probably is less ideological than more efficiency reasons, which amount to a preference for autocracy. How do we quantify the military value of Gwadar, which I mentioned, or Chabahar, for those of you who are not familiar, this port in Iran that had Indian investment, but now appears to likely be sliding more toward a Chinese investment. I certainly I'm not the person to quantify military value of any of these places. I don't do that for a living. What I can say is that at some basic level, none of this amounts to yet the true string of pearls, for those of you may be familiar with a kind of a constellation of different dual use ports or military facilities throughout the Indo-Pacific that could be knitted together by China. And some American strategists have worried about it's not that, it's not nearly that yet, may never be that. But it's something more than many observers of China anticipated or expected, say 5 or 10 years ago. China at the time was claiming that it would never have overseas bases, and people were taking China at its word. And we know now that that is absolutely not the case. So how China will make use of these things over time is certainly not something that we can read from Chinese talking points. We have to be more clever than that. We have to recognize that, sure, the port of Gwadar, as I write about it, was importantly in Pakistan, a Pakistani project for Pakistani purposes. But now that it's being built and has been built, it may have the potential to offer China overland access to the Arabian Sea. And that is not nothing for a power, a great power, a rising superpower that wishes to access the hydrocarbons of the Middle East and potentially to place pressure on a competitor in India in terms of shutting down its own access to exactly those same resources. So there's a strategic consequence to these moves that we ignore and downplay, I think, at our peril. But putting a particular value on it at this point is quite difficult, for me at least. Last point, the Russia-Iran conflict brewing in the Caucasus. Look, lots of other scenarios strike me as more plausible ones for a Chinese intervention. One thing that we do know is, and I don't want to come across as being so concerned about the rise of China that I don't make clear that China is also relatively risk averse, has been inclined to avoid sticking its neck out for anyone other than China or finding itself in a tight spot. It has been much more eager to play a skillful navigation, avoiding conflicts between other states as much as is possible. And this looks to me, as bad as it is, this looks to me like a conflict that China could very easily steer clear of. It's not that close to China. It would touch upon Chinese interests in terms of access and some of its plans for this Belt and Road Initiative across the Caucasus. It would certainly play into a broader question of geopolitics in the region. But this is one that China would, I would think, would almost certainly just sit out. Ones that I'm much more concerned about are certainly the India-Pakistan conflict or China's direct conflict with India, or even a direct conflict with the United States over something like Taiwan. All of these rise to a higher level of concern for me than even this troubling development in the Caucasus.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I'm going to take 2, 3 different questions are coming from the hall. First one, I think the first person was my friend over here. Remember your name and nationality, please, and then your question.
Hey, thanks for speaking this evening, Dr. Markey. My name is Jordan Martin. I'm from North Carolina. My question is in regard to how you would characterize China's neo-imperial intentions, more specifically, are there intentions in the area for development and expanding their influence? Are they zero-sum? Are they malign, as critics in the US and India would characterize them? Are they engaging in debt diplomacy, or is it more, as China would argue, that they simply intend to expand their market and their influence within their own region?
Okay, I'll take 2. So I'll take my friend here who was second, and then we'll come to you.
Hi, it's great to speak with you. My name is Nick Kaufman. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm actually at the Hopkins Nanjing Center in a normal year, but I'm here at SAIS, so this is especially interesting to me.
He's in exile.
Yeah. You mentioned that China's rule in their domestic Far West, I think you referred to rule in Xinjiang as being ironclad. In China's dealings with predominantly Muslim countries, especially in the Middle East, has there been economic or political backlash towards China's control over domestic Muslim minorities, or has it been more or less business as usual?
Okay, Dan, if you answer those 2, then I'll just take maybe 1 or 2 more from the audience after you've answered.
Fantastic. Okay, Chinese intentions. So, you know, I always get a lot of questions about what China is really trying to do, and part of it, I've tried to answer some broad observations about its expanding ambitions and motivations and rationale. Some of it is, you know, known only to China's leaders. They don't share their innermost thoughts with me. But when you look at this narrower question, as I think you framed it, over zero-sum development, and in particular, the claims about debt diplomacy, debt trap diplomacy, then I think we get into some interesting territory. And I can say a bit more about that. So the poster child for debt trap diplomacy is Sri Lanka. I can't tell you the number of times that I've been in meetings where Sri Lanka is pointed to as an example of where the Chinese came in, offered to finance a pet project, this Hambantota port of the then Sri Lankan leaders, and which happened to be in their hometown. Basically, the leader, they put this forward. The Sri Lankans actually were in no position to take out the kinds of loans that they did, were unable to pay it back, and as a consequence, China renegotiated the deal and effectively took over the port project altogether, ending up with equity stakes and a port in a place that is close to India with some potential strategic value to China. And all of this is identified as what can go wrong when China comes in and basically swoops into an unsuspecting, vulnerable state and puts on offer all kinds of loans that they know that can't be paid back, and then takes over. And the word to the wise around the world is, be careful, don't be like Sri Lanka. Okay, there are aspects of that that are absolutely true. You shouldn't be like Sri Lanka. This was a terrible move. This was politically motivated rationale, poorly thought through, no commercial viability. They were just putting themselves at China's mercy, and they were doing so, though, for reasons that had everything to do with their own domestic politics and the desire of their political leaders to demonstrate that they could get things done and that they had China's backing. And I do not think, actually, though I would be happy to be proven wrong, that China went in initially with a grand strategy for attempting to buy itself a Sri Lankan port. There are a variety of reasons to wonder whether this is actually strategically valuable to China at all, so that's a starting point. But beyond that, the way that this unfolded was a Sri Lankan political story. And the way that the deal then unraveled as the same leaders in Sri Lanka were voted out of office, new leaders came in and they wanted to renegotiate with the Chinese. All of this reflected the messiness of the Sri Lankan case, and new strictures or prohibitions on what China could use this territory, this port for, imposed by the Sri Lankans, further reinforce that. So in terms of backing back, in terms of Chinese intentions, unclear, but more likely that they intended to buy political influence with a Sri Lankan leader, that they had no prior goal to build out a port in Sri Lanka, but that perhaps over time they saw the potential of that and went with it. Opportunism is probably the word that I use most in this book to define China's activities. Where opportunities open up, they will explore them. They are a rising and expanding and ambitious power. That needs to be understood. But they don't necessarily create those opportunities themselves. They're created for them by political leaders. And they can at times be shut down by those same political leaders if they get voted out of office or die or whatever else. So there's a local story that's really critical here, not just a Chinese story. Then the backlash over the Uyghurs. I always get this question. It's exactly the right kind of question we should be asking. In countries like Kazakhstan or Iran or Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, all Muslim majority countries, which have at least some religious connection to the Muslims of China. And in Kazakhstan in particular, where they have an ethnic tie and a direct land border connection to Xinjiang and to China, where some people of Kazakh ethnicity have been swept up in the same Chinese repression that has been targeting Uyghur Muslims inside of China, they very clearly, these publics, are increasingly aware of and angry, I think, about what the Chinese are up to. But remember, these are the same countries where almost all of their leaders are making literally billions of dollars out of their commercial interactions with Chinese entities, and which find themselves very unable to criticize China in any way that would upset Beijing and jeopardize those projects, which in turn could jeopardize their political viability. The upshot of this is that the publics in many of these countries, I perceive, are increasingly angry, not just about China, and China is the far away problem. They're angry about their own leaders and about them being seeming to be pro-Chinese puppets. And the cleavages there, the political cleavages which are emerging in each of these countries that I've named, are something to watch, because it hasn't yet developed to the point that this is, I mean, you've seen some scattered protests, even in Kazakhstan, which is a place that doesn't normally have protests. You've seen some public statements in Iran, even from some clerics who have been opposed to that regime's sort of soft peddling of its dealings with China. But it hasn't yet risen to the level. I would expect that this will be both an area, first of all, to watch, an area that would potentially be a major cleavage and political tipping point within some of these societies over time. And of course, something that China is itself incredibly sensitive to. And when I talked about tools of repression and propaganda and censorship, all of these things are being used actively to try to tamp down public sentiment on these issues, reshape that sentiment, redirect it, and give a different view of what China is. So all of these things will be at play.
Okay, I'm going to take a last question now, Dan, and it's from my friend here with the white polo next one.
I apologize. This gentleman's question was the gist of mine.
Oh, right, okay. Well, any further questions? Yes, there's a gentleman at the back.
Hi, sir. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Brendan. I come from the U.S. You touched on it briefly, but China seems to have a global hegemony on the information environment these days, if you will, ranging from anything as subtle to allegations of backdoors in its social media or tech platforms like Huawei, ranging all the way to straight political or information warfare, like recently its simulated attack on Anderson Air Force Base in Guam. And this is nothing new, but do you see this becoming more systematic as it expands its BNI? And do you think there's going to be any effort to keep that in check? Thanks.
The short answer is absolutely yes. And there are many, many, many in policymakers in the United States and elsewhere who are really increasingly focused on all of these issues. I'll just sort of tell one story that's not directly related to the information warfare in the way that you described it, but one of the more fascinating developments that we've seen in terms of China's projection into the global media space is what has now been called wolf warrior diplomacy. And this is a harshly aggressive nationalistic portrayal and kind of use of social media and regular media by Chinese diplomats, including one of their top diplomats or top spokespeople in their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, this individual, who's now kind of the poster child for this wolf warrior diplomacy, got his start. I should say, I met him years ago in Washington, D.C., when he was relatively more junior, working in the Chinese embassy on South Asia. His next posting was to be the #2, the deputy chief of mission at China's embassy in Islamabad. And while there, China was expanding its involvement with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And there were a number of opposition voices that were coming up and asking difficult questions and critical questions about what China was up to. And he, I think, very clearly backed by the embassy, took it upon himself to become a wolf warrior diplomat, that is a tough guy, on Twitter. And he became the embassy's Twitter combatant against all comers in Pakistan and became a Twitter sensation, striking against anyone who dared question or raise concerns about what China was up to in Pakistan in the most, I would say, undiplomatic terms. As he was doing that, he was getting more fame, but only in Pakistan. Most people weren't paying attention. But toward the end of his tenure in Pakistan, he started picking fights with Americans, including former National Security Advisor Susan Rice, and criticizing race issues in the United States, lashing out at the Americans on a range of things, and picking battles, Twitter battles with her. Now remember, Twitter is not legal in China. So this was something that was clearly intended for international audiences. And for all of this, rather than being demoted or fired or otherwise put out of the diplomatic service, he was promoted and put in a position to deliver exactly these type of speeches and tweets from the podium now in Beijing. And so this I see as an example of the evolution of China's use of new media. It is not so much Huawei backdoor entry and control over data or information warfare in the cyber sense. This is right out there in the open. But China is playing a very different game, riskier game. Some would question whether this is actually working. It depends on which audience they're trying to target. But this is a new forms of political influence, new forms of diplomacy that are seeing new pioneering entrepreneurial efforts by Chinese diplomats and changing the way that we understand China and the way China relates to the world.
Dan, we're out of time. It was a 40-minute talk followed by a 40-minute Q&A. It's a kind of platonic ideal of what a Bologna Center talk should be like. At this point, I would normally give you a handcrafted and hand-painted white ceramic wine stopper, but when you come to Bologna, it'll be there on my shelves and you can have it. Thanks for starting the History of the Present series in such a sophisticated and fascinating way. You've certainly convinced me that this is a major event in international politics and one that will have repercussions for going forward. Thanks very much. Goodbye.